The English Civil War ended the way all great conflicts are supposed to end, with a winner. Parliament defeated the king, tried him for treason, and on a freezing January morning in 1649, took his head off outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. A vast crowd had gathered to watch, and when the axe fell, they did not cheer. An eyewitness standing in that crowd wrote that the sound that rose from thousands of throats was such a groan as I never heard before, and desire I may never hear again. Not triumph, not relief, a groan. The English had just done something that had never been done in the Christian world, executed their own anointed king. And even those who had fought hardest for it seemed to understand in that moment that something had gone terribly wrong. What followed was 11 years that almost no one who lived through them could explain. Parliament won the war and got a military dictatorship. The Scots fought for their church and ended up occupied. The men who demanded the king govern within the law watched the man who replaced him dissolve Parliament at gunpoint, twice. And when it was all finally over, England did the only thing left to do. It invited the dead king's son to come home and take the throne. Every life spent, every family broken, every principle declared worth dying for, and the crown went back to the Stuarts. This is the story of the English Civil War. Not the war England thought it was fighting, but the one it actually got. England in the early 17th century had no written constitution. There was no document, no single text, no agreed set of rules that defined where royal power ended and parliamentary authority began. What it had instead was habit. Centuries of accumulated custom, precedent, and mutual accommodation had produced something that functioned like a constitution without ever being one. A series of understandings so old that most men alive had never seen them tested, and so assumed they never would be. At the center of this arrangement sat two powers that needed each other. The king governed. He commanded the army, directed foreign policy, appointed his ministers, and exercised the executive authority of the realm as a matter of sacred right. But governing cost money. And raising the money that governing required, particularly the customs duties on trade that funded the ordinary running of the state, required Parliament's approval. A king could reign. Without Parliament, he could barely function. Parliament, for its part, could not govern either. It had no executive power, no army, no machinery to implement anything it decided. What it had was the power to grant or withhold the funds a king needed to operate. That leverage was real, but it only worked at the moments when the king needed money badly enough to summon Parliament to session. Between those moments, Parliament did not exist. The king called it, set its agenda, and dissolved it when he chose. The balance between them was entirely informal, and it held only as long as both sides chose to respect it. The men who sat in Parliament in the 1620s and 1630s did not think of themselves as revolutionaries. They were landowners, lawyers, merchants, and gentlemen who had inherited their seats alongside their estates. They believed, with complete sincerity, that they were defending liberties as old as England itself, rights embedded in common law, affirmed in Magna Carta, and passed down through generations of English governance. To challenge the king's illegal acts was not rebellion. It was, in their understanding, the preservation of the proper order. The king believed something equally sincere and entirely incompatible. The crown held its authority from God, not from Parliament, not from law courts, not from the consent of gentlemen in a chamber at Westminster. A king who submitted his prerogative to parliamentary scrutiny was not governing. He was abdicating. James I, who preceded Charles and had laid out this theology of kingship in explicit terms, once told Parliament directly that it was a favor and not a right that they met at all. He meant it. And his son inherited the belief, without the political instinct to know when to keep it to himself. What made this combustible was not that either side was wrong exactly. The king genuinely did hold executive authority. Parliament genuinely did hold the power of the purse. Both claims were real, both were legitimate, and neither had ever been formally reconciled because they had never needed to be. For generations, the two powers had found ways to accommodate each other, making concessions and trading favors in the unwritten language of a system that ran on goodwill. What the 17th century was about to discover was what happened when the goodwill ran out. Charles Stuart was not supposed to be king. He was the second son. In despair, small, sickly, and left behind in Scotland as an infant while his family moved south to London, because the journey was considered too dangerous for a child so frail. He did not walk until he was nearly 4. He stammered all his life. His elder brother Henry was everything Charles was not: tall, athletic, magnetic, the obvious king in waiting. When Henry died suddenly of typhoid fever in 1612, Charles was 12 years old and entirely unprepared for what had just fallen on him. He spent the following years preparing with a discipline that never quite overcame the insecurities underneath. He took up riding and became an accomplished horseman. He taught himself to project stillness where he could not project ease. He collected art with the passion of a man building a world he could control. Over 2,000 paintings and sculptures, Titian, Raphael, Da Vinci, Rubens, works that turned the royal palaces into something approaching the great courts of Europe. When he brought the Flemish painter Anthony van Dyck to London and set him to work, Van Dyck produced something extraordinary: a series of portraits in which Charles appeared on horseback, armored, surveying the English countryside from the back of a great horse, imperial, serene, sovereign beyond question. The man in the portraits was barely 5 feet 4 inches tall. He knew it, and he commissioned accordingly. In private, Charles was genuinely admirable. Those who knew him well described a man of exceptional courtesy, deep religious sincerity, and real tenderness toward his wife and children. His marriage to Henrietta Maria, which had begun in coldness and suspicion, became a love match. He was faithful, sober, and consistent in his personal conduct in ways his father James had conspicuously not been. Archbishop Laud, who knew him well, called him a mild and gracious prince. His enemies, who would eventually take his head, acknowledged the same qualities, which is part of what made what they were doing so difficult to explain to themselves. The problem was not his character, but his theology. Charles had absorbed from his father James an absolute conviction that kings governed by divine appointment, and that this appointment placed them beyond the reach of human judgment. He did not merely believe this politically, so as a useful doctrine. He believed it as a devout Christian believes in the resurrection, as an article of personal faith that could not be compromised without sinning. He wrote plainly, "Princes are not bound to give account of their actions, but to God alone." He meant it literally. To yield to Parliament on any question of royal prerogative was not, in his understanding, a tactical retreat. It was an act of impiety. His father James had held the same views but tempered them with cunning. James lectured Parliament about divine right, and then quietly found ways to work with it when he needed to. He understood the gap between what a king claimed and what a king could actually do, and he navigated it with enough flexibility to avoid catastrophe. Charles inherited the theology without the flexibility. Where James would bluster and then deal, Charles would assert a principle and hold it past the point of reason. His advisors noticed it early. His enemies noticed it faster. In almost every confrontation with Parliament, there arrived a moment when a concession would have resolved the crisis, and Charles chose not to make it. Not out of tactical calculation, but because he genuinely believed concession was wrong. The cruelty of his situation was that he was not entirely wrong. The royal prerogative he defended was real. Parliament's encroachments on it were genuine. Other monarchs in other countries governed with far less restraint than Charles was ever asking for, and no one called it tyranny. But England in the 1620s and 1630s was not other countries, and the men he was dealing with in Parliament were not subjects to be managed. They were landowners and lawyers who had spent 20 years developing an increasingly confident sense of their own constitutional standing. Charles read them as troublesome subordinates. They were becoming something else entirely. The collision between his character and his moment was almost perfectly calibrated for disaster. A more ruthless king might have crushed the opposition early. A more flexible one might have negotiated it into irrelevance. Charles was too principled to be ruthless and too rigid to be flexible. He was, as one historian later put it, an altogether better man than he was a politician. And in the crisis that was coming, the politics were the only thing that mattered. On the 10th of March, 1629, Charles dismissed Parliament and had no intention of calling it back. He had been king for 4 years, had summoned 3 parliaments, and had found each one more obstructive than the last. He would govern without them. The period that followed, 11 years in which no parliament sat, his supporters called the personal rule. His enemies called it the 11 years tyranny. Both names were accurate, depending on who was paying attention and what they were being asked to pay. The immediate problem was money. Without Parliament, Charles had no access to the taxation that Parliament alone could authorize, so his lawyers went looking for what the law did allow. What they found was a treasury of medieval precedents, old obligations, dormant statutes, and forgotten dues that were technically still on the books, even if no one had enforced them in living memory. Charles enforced them all. Men who owned land worth £40 a year and had failed to attend his coronation for knighthood were fined for their absence. Landowners whose estates had quietly crept into boundaries that were once royal forest found those boundaries suddenly reasserted and were charged accordingly. Each measure was, in isolation, arguably legal. Taken together, they read as what they were: a king finding new ways to take money from the very people whose support he needed most. The most provocative device was ship money. In its original form, the levy was an old emergency measure by which coastal towns provided ships, or money for ships, in times of naval threat. Charles revived it in 1634 and charged only the coastal counties, which was within historical precedent. He then extended it inland. Then he made it annual. By 1636, ship money was raising £200,000 a year, more than any single parliamentary subsidy had ever produced, and the gentlemen paying it had grasped a truth that frightened them far more than the money itself. If this worked, Charles did not need Parliament. If Charles did not need Parliament, the leverage that Parliament had held for generations over the crown was gone. They were not paying a tax. They were watching a constitutional settlement dissolve. In 1637, John Hampden, a Buckinghamshire gentleman of no particular prominence, refused to pay his ship money assessment of 20 shillings, a sum so small it was barely worth collecting. The case he brought before the courts was lost by a single vote among 12 judges. But the arguments made in his defense circulated through every county in England. The law was ambiguous. The king's right was contested. Hampden lost the case and became a national figure overnight, which told Charles rather more about the state of opinion than the verdict had. While the money disputes bred resentment in manor houses and market towns, the religious policy of Archbishop William Laud bred something closer to fear. Laud had been Charles's Archbishop of Canterbury since 1633, and he pursued a program of ceremonial reform in the Church of England that pushed worship back toward the ordered rituals of the pre-Reformation Church: candles, altars railed off from the congregation, formal liturgy, the insistence that religion be beautiful rather than austere. To moderate Protestants, this looked like drift toward Rome. To Puritans, convinced that the Reformation was already only half done, it looked like surrender to the Antichrist. Laud did not merely irritate his opponents, he prosecuted them. In the summer of 1637, 3 men, a physician named John Bastwick, a clergyman named Henry Burton, and a lawyer named William Prynne, were hauled before the Star Chamber for publishing pamphlets attacking the bishops. The Star Chamber sentenced all 3 to life imprisonment, to fines they could not pay, and to the public cropping of their ears. Prynne, who had already had his ears partially cropped for an earlier offense, had the stumps removed and his cheeks branded with the letters S.L., seditious libeler. He told the crowd watching from the pillory that the letters stood for stigmata laudis, the mark of loud. The crowd that had gathered to watch did not go home frightened. It went home angry. The men who would have been most useful to Charles in managing this gathering discontent were the same men he was alienating. The gentry who sat on local courts, collected the king's levies, enforced his orders, and kept the counties functioning were landowners themselves. They paid the forest fines. They paid ship money. Their neighbors paid ship money. They administered a system they privately considered illegal on behalf of a king they could not criticize openly. The grudge was quiet, diffuse, and running through every level of the political nation. Not the rage of the dispossessed, but the cold anger of men who felt they were being treated as subjects rather than as partners in the governance of their own country. Yet the surface of England in the 1630s was calm. The harvests were reasonable. There was no plague, no foreign war, no visible crisis. A French Capuchin priest visiting in the middle of the decade reported back to Paris that England was a prosperous and tranquil country, its people well fed and its fields productive. He was not wrong about the fields. He could not see what was building underneath them, 11 years of slow, compounding grievance in men who had no outlet for it and no means of redress, waiting for someone to open a door. Charles had governed England for 11 years without Parliament. He had found ways to raise money, silence opposition, and hold the machinery of the state together through improvisation, legal ingenuity, and sheer force of will. What he had not done was govern Scotland. Scotland had its own church and its own parliament, its own legal system, and a deep conviction that these things were not the king's to redesign. When Charles decided in 1637 that Scottish worship should conform to an Anglican prayer book written in London, he was not merely introducing a liturgical reform. He was reaching into the spiritual life of a nation that had not asked for his guidance and telling it that it was wrong. The new prayer book was used for the first time at St. Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh on the morning of Sunday, the 23rd of July, 1637. The Dean of Edinburgh, James Hannay, had barely begun to read the collects before a woman in the congregation, a market trader named Jenny Geddes, though the name may be as much legend as history, stood up from her stool and hurled it at his head. She was heard to shout, in Scots, words that translate roughly as, "Dare you say the Mass in my ear?" The stool missed. The riot that followed did not. Bibles, stools, and stones filled the air inside St. Giles as the congregation turned on the minister. The service was abandoned. Outside on the high street, the crowds hammered on the cathedral doors. What happened at St. Giles was not an isolated outbreak of temper. Across the Scottish lowlands, the same fury erupted simultaneously in too many places with too much organization behind it to be spontaneous. Scottish noblemen, ministers, and lawyers had been coordinating resistance to the prayer book for months. The riot gave the movement its moment. Within weeks, petitions flooded into Edinburgh from every corner of the country. By February 1638, delegates from across Scottish society had gathered in Edinburgh to sign a document called the National Covenant, a sworn declaration invoking the authority of God and the precedents of Scottish law to resist the king's religious innovations and defend the native church at any cost. The Covenant spread through Scotland with a speed that stunned the royal administration. Copies circulated to every parish and burgh for signature. Noblemen signed it in the great houses. Ministers signed it from their pulpits. Common people signed it in the streets. Those who hesitated were sometimes pressured into signing. Those in remote areas signed in their hundreds anyway. The document was careful to profess loyalty to the king as civil ruler, while explicitly rejecting his authority over the church. Charles read this distinction as a legal fiction designed to dress up treason. He was not entirely wrong, but he was also not entirely right, and the inability to tell the difference cost him everything that followed. Charles responded as he always responded, by deciding that the problem required force, and that he was justified in using it. In the spring of 1639, he marched an English army north toward the Scottish border. The army that assembled was underfunded, poorly provisioned, and filled with men who had no enthusiasm for fighting their Protestant neighbors on behalf of a king, many of them privately distrusted. It reached the border, looked at the Scottish army assembled on the other side, 20,000 Covenanters, many of them veterans of the Continental Wars, commanded by the experienced Alexander Leslie, and declined to attack. The resulting agreement, the pacification of Berwick, resolved nothing and satisfied no one. Both sides went home to prepare for the next round. The Second Bishops' War in the summer of 1640 was worse. The Scottish army under Leslie bypassed the English defenses entirely, crossed the Tyne at Newburn on the 28th of August, and routed the 5,000 English troops holding the ford with a combination of superior artillery and the simple fact that the English soldiers did not want to fight. Newcastle fell 2 days later. Within weeks, the Scots held all of Northumberland and County Durham, and with it, the coal fields that supplied London with the most of its fuel. And the king, who had governed without Parliament for 11 years, was now paying a foreign army £850 a day to sit on English soil and wait. There was only one place the money to pay the Scots could come from. There was only one institution with the authority to raise it. On the 3rd of November 1640, Charles summoned what would become known as the Long Parliament, the first parliament to sit in 11 years. He had no intention of giving it power. He had no choice but to give it leverage. The men who walked into Westminster that autumn knew exactly what they held, and had been waiting 11 years to hold it. The negotiations that would lead to civil war had already begun, even if no one in the chamber had yet used that word. The Scots had not set out to destroy the English Constitution. They had wanted to preserve their own church. But in doing so, they had done something that 11 years of English grievance had failed to accomplish. They had forced Charles back to Parliament, broke, humiliated, and dependent on the goodwill of the very men he had spent a decade trying to make irrelevant. The pin had been pulled. Whatever happened next would happen inside Westminster, not outside it. The men who walked into Westminster on the 3rd of November 1640 had been waiting 11 years for this moment. They were not revolutionaries, not yet. They were landowners and lawyers who believed they were restoring something that had been taken from them, not building something new. But the accumulated grievances of a decade without Parliament had hardened into something that looked, from Charles' side of the chamber, and very much like organized fury. Within days of opening, the Long Parliament had begun systematically dismantling everything the personal rule had built. Their first target was Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, Charles's most powerful minister and the man Parliament feared most. Strafford had governed Ireland with an iron efficiency that made him the model of royal authority unchecked by representative bodies. And he had advised the king, in a phrase that Parliament would not forget, that the king was loosed and absolved from all rules of government when Parliament defied him. He was impeached on the 11th of November, barely a week after Parliament assembled, and sent to the Tower before he could organize any defense. The impeachment trial that followed was a problem, and Strafford was a formidable lawyer, and he defended himself so effectively against the charges of treason that the parliamentary managers began to fear they would lose the case on the evidence. John Pym, the dominant figure in the Commons, reached for a different instrument, the Bill of Attainder, an act of Parliament that declared a man guilty and condemned him to death without requiring a verdict from any court. It required no proof, only a majority vote. Parliament was now doing to Strafford precisely what it had spent 11 years accusing Charles of doing to Englishmen generally, circumventing the law to achieve a political result. Charles had promised Strafford his personal protection. He meant it. But London that spring of 1641 was not safe for a king who stood between Parliament and its target, and crowds filled the streets demanding Strafford's execution. Mobs surrounded the palace. When rumors spread that the king was planning a military coup to free his minister, the Lords voted for the attainder by 51-9. Charles signed the death warrant on the 10th of May, writing afterwards that he had no greater cause of grief in his life. Strafford was beheaded 2 days later on Tower Hill before a crowd estimated at hundreds of thousands. Among those watching from a window of the tower was Archbishop Laud, who had himself been impeached the previous December. He fainted. With Strafford dead, Parliament moved through the machinery of the personal rule with systematic efficiency. Ship money was declared illegal. The courts that Charles had used to punish his critics, the Star Chamber, the High Commission, were abolished. The Triennial Act required that Parliament meet at least every 3 years, regardless of the king's wishes. A further act, extraordinary in its implications, prohibited the dissolution of the current Parliament without its own consent. Charles signed all of it. He had no choice. He was broke, the Scots were still on English soil, and Parliament alone controlled the money to pay them to leave. Through the summer and autumn of 1641, the mood inside Parliament began to shift. The early unity, unanimous in opposing the personal rule, was fracturing along a fault line that would define the coming war. Moderates, who had wanted the king's illegal acts reversed and his ministers punished, believed the job was largely done. Radicals, led by Pym, believed that Charles could not be trusted with the powers that would remain to him even after all the concessions, and pushed for Parliament to take control of the king's ministers, his army, and his church. The moderates were not wrong to worry. Neither were the radicals. In October 1641, Ireland exploded. A Catholic rebellion in Ulster unleashed massacres of Protestant settlers on a scale that sent shockwaves through every Protestant household in the three kingdoms. An army was needed to suppress it. Everyone agreed on that. The question of who would command that army tore Parliament apart. Parliament did not trust Charles with an army, having spent a year arguing that he had used every instrument of power he possessed against his own people. Charles did not trust Parliament with an army, believing, not unreasonably, and that it might use the army against him. The Irish rebellion had opened a question that the constitutional arrangements of England had no answer for, and both sides knew it. On the 22nd of November 1641, Parliament passed the Grand Remonstrance, a document listing over 150 grievances against Charles's reign, from his religious policies to his financial innovations to his choice of ministers, and proposing that Parliament take effective control of royal appointments going forward. It passed by 11 votes, 159 to 148. The margin was so thin that members drew their swords in the chamber during the debate. Charles rejected it entirely. Both sides had now said publicly what they wanted. The distance between those positions had no political solution left inside it. By the winter of 1641, Charles had persuaded himself that 5 men were responsible for everything: John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Holles, Arthur Hazelrig, and William Strode. These 5 members of the Commons had, in his reading, orchestrated the entire parliamentary opposition, encouraged the Scottish invasion, and were now whipping the London mob into a fury against the crown. If he could remove them, The moderate majority in Parliament would reassert itself, and the crisis would dissolve. He had spent the better part of a year looking for a legal mechanism to arrest them. By January 1642, he had decided to dispense with the mechanism. The Queen, Henrietta Maria, was more decisive than her husband on the question. When Charles hesitated in the days before the attempt, she told him, in words that circulated through London almost immediately, that he should go and pull those rogues out by the ears or not come back to see her face. Whatever the precise phrasing, the substance was clear. The king's wife had called him a coward in front of his own court. He went. On the afternoon of the 4th of January 1642, Charles left Whitehall with somewhere between 300 and 400 armed men, officers from his recently disbanded army, soldiers and retainers, and marched on the Palace of Westminster. He left most of them in the lobby. He entered the Commons' chamber itself, accompanied only by his nephew, the Elector Palatine. No king had ever set foot inside the House of Commons before. The members stood in silence as he walked to the front of the chamber, removed his hat in acknowledgement of the House, and took the Speaker's chair. The 5 men were not there. They had been warned, by the French ambassador, some said, though the precise source was never fully established, and had slipped out while Charles was still making his way from Whitehall. They were already on a barge heading downriver to the City of London, where the crowds were solidly behind Parliament and where no royal warrant could easily reach them. Charles looked across a chamber of silent members, searched the empty benches, and turned to the Speaker, William Lenthal, demanding to know where they were. Lenthal dropped to his knees and gave the answer that would define parliamentary independence for the next 4 centuries. He had, he said, neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in that place, except as the House directed him. Charles said only, "I see the birds have flown." He walked out. The silence that followed him through the chamber was of a particular kind, not the silence of a cowed body, but the silence of men who had just watched a king humiliate himself in front of them, and who knew exactly what they were going to do with it. Within hours, the story was across London. By nightfall, the crowds outside were hostile. When Charles went to the Guildhall 2 days later to demand the city's support in surrendering the 5 members, the merchants and aldermen who received him were silent, and from the galleries above their heads the word came down in a hiss: privilege. Privilege, the single word that meant Parliament's rights and that told the king what the City of London had decided. Charles fled London on the 10th of January, to moving first to Hampton Court and then to Windsor. He would never return to his capital as a free man. The royal family packed what they could. Henrietta Maria left for the continent in February, ostensibly to escort their eldest daughter to safety, but in practice to raise money and military support from the Catholic courts of Europe. The departure of the Queen Catholic, the French princess, whose religion had been a source of Protestant anxiety for 17 years, was read in every London parish as exactly what it was: a royal family preparing for war. Parliament moved with the speed of an institution that knew it had won the moment and intended to press it. The Militia Ordinance of March 1642 claimed for Parliament the authority to raise and command an army without royal assent on Parliament's sole authority, a claim that had no legal foundation in any previous English practice. Charles countered with the Commission of Array, his own medieval instrument for raising troops, equally contested in law. 2 institutions that had coexisted for generations without a written constitution were now without any mechanism for resolution, both claiming the right to command the armed force of England. There was no court to adjudicate it. There was no precedent that settled it. There was only the army that each side could actually raise. England did not divide cleanly. That is the first thing to understand about the summer of 1642. There was no line on the map, no moment where the country snapped in 2 halves and each half marched to its assigned position. What happened was far messier and far more human than that. Towns debated and stalled. The county committees passed contradictory resolutions. Neighbors who had known each other all their lives found themselves standing on opposite sides of something they could not fully explain and discovered only later that they were at war. In broad terms, the Royalist cause drew its strength from the north and west of England, from Wales, and from communities where the traditional ties of land, tenancy, and loyalty to the local noble had not yet frayed. Parliament was strongest in the south and east, in London, in the cloth-making towns, among the merchants and tradesmen who had most to lose from a king who collected money without consent, and most to gain from a constitutional settlement that made such things impossible. The Navy went almost entirely to Parliament, yet which gave it control of the sea lanes and the trade that kept London funded. These were broad tendencies, not iron rules. Every county had Royalists and Parliamentarians. Every regiment had men who had joined because their landlord had, or because they needed the wages, or because a recruiter had been more persuasive than the alternatives. Some families split the difference deliberately. In households where no one could be certain who would win, brothers declared for opposite sides as a form of insurance, so that whatever happened to England, something of the family's lands and standing would survive. The Verneys of Buckinghamshire were among the most discussed examples of this kind of fracture. Sir Edmund Verney, who had served the royal household for decades and who had helped raise the small, a sickly boy Charles, when he was still Duke of York, took the king's commission and became the keeper of the royal standard. His son Ralph, who shared none of his father's royalist certainty, declared for Parliament. They argued through the spring of 1642 and parted without resolution. Sir Edmund told his son he had no personal quarrel with Parliament's cause, but he had eaten the king's bread and served him 30 years, and he would not do so dishonorable a thing as to desert him now. He carried the standard into battle at Edgehill that October. He did not carry it out. On the 22nd of August 1642, Charles raised his royal standard on a hill outside Nottingham Castle. The ceremony was meant to be a declaration of war, a solemn, visible summoning of loyal England to the king's cause. Contemporary accounts describe something considerably less solemn. The crowd was thin. The local gentry attendance fell short of expectation. The proclamation was read aloud, but the herald stumbled over the words because the king had made last-minute corrections to the text in his own hand, and the changes were difficult to follow. That evening, a storm blew the standard down. Those who were looking for omens did not have to look hard. Parliament appointed Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, to command its army. Essex was a careful, methodical soldier with solid continental experience and a personal history of misfortune. His father had been executed for treason against Elizabeth I, and the son had spent most of his adult life trying to recover the family's honor through service. He was dependable, well-respected, yes, and temperamentally suited to the cautious kind of war that Parliament initially needed. He was less suited to the decisive, aggressive war that the situation would eventually demand. Both sides would discover the limitations of their commanders at roughly the same moment. Charles placed enormous confidence in his nephew Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who arrived in England in 1642 at 23 years old, having already fought in some of the most brutal campaigns of the 30 Years' War on the continent. Rupert was everything the Royalist cavalry needed: bold, technically sophisticated, personally fearless, and able to inspire men who had never fought before to follow him at speed into the mouths of enemy guns. He was rather less suited to the strategic patience that winning a war, as opposed to winning a battle, required. The Royalist cavalry under his command would prove, repeatedly, to be the most dangerous weapon on either side of the field, and the most consistently wasted one. Both sides, in August of 1642, believed the war would be short. Parliament thought a show of serious force would bring Charles to terms. Charles thought the sight of a royal army in the field would scatter parliamentary resolve and restore the natural order. Neither side had a plausible plan for what to do if the other refused to collapse quickly. Neither side had anything close to the money, organization, or military structure that a long war would require. They were, in this, as in so many things, wrong about the same thing at the same time. And the consequences of being wrong would take 7 years and somewhere near 200,000 lives to fully reveal themselves. The men who filled the ranks on both sides were not, for the most part, ideologues. Some were the convinced Puritans who saw Parliament's cause as God's work, the Royalist officers who believed that an attack on the king's authority was an attack on the natural order that held the universe together. But many more were tenants who followed their landlord, laborers who needed the shilling a day, craftsmen caught on the wrong side of a county border when the armies were raised. If captured, they were often pressed into the opposing army without ceremony. The war had a way of making the political personal very quickly, and the personal impossible to undo. The first major battle of the English Civil War was fought on the afternoon of the 23rd of October, 1642, on a sodden hillside in Warwickshire called Edgehill. That neither army had planned to be there. Essex had been marching to intercept the king's route to London. Charles had been moving toward London itself. Their scouts stumbled across each other almost by accident, and by the time both sides had formed their lines on the open fields below the escarpment, the sun was already past its midpoint and the light was going. They fought anyway. The Royalist cavalry on both flanks, under Prince Rupert and Lord Wilmot, opened the battle with a charge that shattered the Parliamentary horse entirely. Rupert's troopers rode with the looseness of men used to the hunting field, giving their horses their heads and crashing into the Parliamentary line at full gallop. The Parliamentary cavalry, drilled in the older Dutch fashion of firing from the saddle at a standstill, had no answer for it. Both flanks collapsed within minutes, and then Rupert's cavalry rode straight off the battlefield, pursuing the broken parliamentarians all the way to the village of Kinneton, where they stopped to loot Essex's baggage train. They were flushed with the glory of it. They could not be recalled. With the Royalist cavalry gone, the infantry in the center fought on alone. Essex's foot, better equipped and steadier than the king's, began pushing the Royalist infantry back. A small Parliamentary cavalry reserve under Sir William Balfour, which had remained on the field when the rest fled, broke through the Royalist center and came within reach of capturing the king's 2 young sons, Charles, aged 12, and James, aged 9, who were watching the battle from behind the line. In the chaos of the Royalist center, the king's standard was seized by Parliamentary troops. Sir Edmund Verney, the man carrying it, the same Sir Edmund who had told his son Ralph that he would not dishonor 30 years of royal service by deserting now, refused to release it. He was killed where he stood. The legend that accumulated afterwards said his severed hand was found still gripping the staff. When Rupert's cavalry finally returned from their plundering, the battle had already settled into exhaustion. Both sides had taken around 1,500 casualties. Both sides claimed a victory of sorts. Neither had the stomach to resume in the morning. Essex retreated north to Warwick. Charles, shocked by the scale of the dead, missed the opportunity to march unopposed on London and turned south toward Oxford instead. Edgehill had proved nothing except that neither side was going to collapse at the first serious blow, which meant the war everyone had assumed would be short was going to be neither short nor simple. Charles reached the outskirts of London 3 weeks later. On the 13th of November, at a stretch of common ground called Turnham Green on the western edge of the city, his army of 13,000 men found itself confronted by 24,000. Essex's regulars were there, but so were 6 regiments of the London-trained bands, part-time militia, shopkeepers, and apprentices, and tradesmen who had marched out of the city overnight with their pikes and muskets to stand between the king and their homes. The sergeant major general who commanded them, Philip Skippon, went along their lines before the standoff began and told them to pray heartily and fight heartily, and that God would bless them. They stood. The king looked at the numbers facing him, looked at his supply situation, and turned around. He went to Oxford. He would never come this close to London again. The pattern that had revealed itself at Edgehill Royalist cavalry superiority squandered by indiscipline, parliamentary infantry holding the line, the decisive blow repeatedly almost landing and then failing, continued through the early months of 1643. Prince Rupert raided, skirmished, and demonstrated an aggressive tactical imagination that kept the parliamentary forces perpetually off balance. But every cavalry success that might have been converted into a strategic advantage dissolved in the same way it had at Edgehill. The horsemen rode through the enemy and kept going, leaving the infantry exposed, and the moment passed. Oliver Cromwell, watching this pattern from his position as a cavalry commander in the Eastern Association, was forming very precise conclusions about what a cavalry force needed to be. He wrote in the spring of 1643 to a colleague in Parliament about the quality of the men the parliamentary cause was recruiting. He did not mince the assessment. He told him that they were filling the ranks with old decayed serving men and tapsters, and that the Royalists had gentlemen's sons and men of quality in their saddles who had spirit and resolution. He said they needed men of religion, men who made conscience of what they did. What he was describing, without yet having the army to prove it, was a different kind of soldier altogether, one who fought for something rather than for a landlord's commission or a day's pay, and who could therefore be trusted to stop when ordered to, even with the enemy in full flight ahead of him. That idea would take another 2 years to fully arrive. In the meantime, the killing continued. The war settled, as wars do, into a geography. Parliament held London, the southeast, the great ports, and the navy. The Royalists held the north, the west, and Oxford. Between them lay a ragged Middle England of contested counties, local truces, and communities trying to stay out of it. Ordinary people were not indifferent to the outcome, but many were exhausted by the demands of both sides, billeting soldiers, supplying food and horses, paying assessments to whichever army arrived last and threatened hardest. The rhetoric of both causes, God's truth, England's liberties, the king's sacred right, had very little to say to a tenant farmer who had just lost his horses to a parliamentary requisition party, and whose barn was now full of men with guns who ate whatever was in it. By the winter of 1642 and into 1643, it was clear to anyone willing to look that neither side had the means to finish the war quickly. Parliament had London's wealth and the navy, but an army that could win battles and consistently fail to press them. Charles had a cavalry arm that was, battle for battle, the most dangerous force on the field, now in a strategic situation that required him to win decisively in a country where London was impregnable and Parliament controlled the money supply. Both sides were going to need something they did not yet have. Parliament would find it in Scotland and in the radical reorganization of its own army. Charles would find, in the years ahead, that there was nothing left to find. The summer of 1643 was the closest Charles I came to winning his war. In the north, the west, and the southwest, Royalist armies moved with a confidence and coordination they had not managed before, and had not managed since. The parliamentary cause had survived its first winter intact, but by midsummer, it was beginning to look like survival might be all it managed. 3 separate Royalist armies were advancing from 3 separate directions, and in between them, they were compressing the territory Parliament controlled into something that was starting to look like a slow strangulation. In the north, the Earl of Newcastle had spent the first half of 1643 methodically tightening his grip on Yorkshire. On the 30th of June, his army of 10,000 met the Fairfaxes at Adwalton Moor near Bradford. The parliamentary army fought well enough that Newcastle nearly surrendered. One of his own officers later admitted the Earl had been on the point of quitting the field, but a charge by Colonel Curtin's pikemen at the critical moment broke the parliamentary left wing, and the whole line collapsed with it. Lord Fairfax fled to Bradford. His son Thomas, commanding the right wing, found himself nearly encircled and cut his way out with a small body of men. The 2 Fairfaxes reunited at Hull, and apart from Hull, Yorkshire was Royalist. In the southwest, The Royalist commander Sir Ralph Hopton had been fighting his way east through Cornwall and Somerset against Sir William Waller, the best parliamentary field general in the country. The two men had been close friends and had fought together in the same army on the continent a decade earlier. At Lansdowne Hill on the 5th of July, the Royalists stormed Waller's prepared position on the summit in a frontal assault that cost them grievously. Sir Bevil Grenville, the finest of the Cornish commanders, was killed leading his pikemen up the slope in the battle's decisive charge. Hopton held the field at the end of the day, but his army was spent, its ammunition nearly gone. And Hopton himself was badly injured 2 days later when a captured powder wagon exploded beside him. What followed at Roundway Down on the 13th of July was one of the most remarkable actions of the entire war. Waller had pursued the crippled Royalist force to Devizes and had it surrounded, certain the campaign was over. Prince Maurice rode from Oxford to Devizes overnight with 1,800 cavalry, exhausted men on tired horses, no infantry, no artillery, and attacked an army of 5,000 that included cavalry, foot, and cannon. Within 2 hours, Waller's army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. His cavalry were driven over the edge of a 300-foot escarpment into a ravine that would be called the Bloody Ditch. His infantry, surrounded and without cavalry support, now were cut down where they stood or surrendered in their hundreds. Waller fled to Bristol with what he could save. The Western Association Army, Parliament's entire military strength in the southwest, was gone. 2 weeks after Roundway Down, Prince Rupert appeared before Bristol with a combined Royalist force and demanded the city's surrender. Bristol was England's second city, its greatest port, the western gateway to Ireland, and the hub of a metalworking industry that could supply Royalist armies with weapons. Its parliamentary governor, Colonel Nathaniel Fiennes, refused. Rupert attacked on the 26th of July. The assault was bloody. The Royalists lost perhaps 500 men in the fighting, with senior officers killed and wounded in large numbers storming the walls. But by midday, the outer defenses had been breached. When, by early afternoon, Fiennes opened a parley. Bristol fell that evening. 80 cannon, 1,700 barrels of gunpowder, and 6,000 muskets passed to the king. With Bristol secured and Waller's army destroyed, Charles turned toward Gloucester, the last parliamentary garrison controlling the Severn Valley, blocking his communications between Oxford, Wales, and the West. He arrived before the city on the 10th of August and demanded its surrender, fully expecting it would comply. The governor, a 23-year-old colonel named Edward Massey, sent a politely worded refusal and began organizing the defense. The Royalist siege that followed exposed something that would haunt Charles throughout the war: a chronic inability to conduct sustained siege operations effectively. The artillery was inadequate. Ammunition ran short, to the point where the gunners resorted to firing stones. Miners tunneling toward the East Gate flooded when the weather broke in late August, and London, watching Gloucester hold, was galvanizing itself to save it. The Earl of Essex left London on the 26th of August with 15,000 men. He reached the hill above Gloucester on the 5th of September and fired a cannon salute to tell the defenders that relief had arrived. By that evening, Massey had 3 barrels of gunpowder left. That night, Charles abandoned the siege and marched his army away into the Cotswold Hills. Essex entered Gloucester 2 days later. The Royalist summer had its limit, and Gloucester was it. Charles moved quickly to intercept Essex before he could return to London. He placed his army across the London Road at Newbury on the 19th of September, forcing a battle the following morning on ground that should have favored him. It did not. The First Battle of Newbury lasted 12 hours and ended with the exhausted Royalists withdrawing in the night, leaving Essex to march his army back to London to a rapturous welcome. Charles had been handed the opportunity to end the war on his own terms, at the moment when his armies were strongest and Parliament's cause was at its lowest. He had not taken it at Turnham Green, had not taken it after Roundway Down, and had not taken it at Newbury. The army that Parliament was quietly building in the east would not give him another. By the autumn of 1643, Parliament was in serious difficulty. The Royalist summer had exposed the limits of what it could achieve with the army it had. Essex was competent but cautious, the regional commanders were uneven, and the financial strain of maintaining armies in the field without the machinery of a functioning state behind them was beginning to tell. What Parliament needed was a large, experienced, immediately available military force. Scotland had one. The price, as always with Scotland, was the Church. The agreement signed on the 25th of September 1643 was called the Solemn League and Covenant. Parliament promised to reform the Church of England along Presbyterian lines, to bring it into conformity with the Scottish model of church government, with its elected elders and its rejection of bishops. In return, Scotland would send an army of 22,000 men south across the border. The Scots understood this as a binding religious compact. The English parliamentarians, who contained a strong independent faction with no intention of submitting to Presbyterian church government, understood it as a military alliance with sufficiently vague religious language to be revisited later. Both sides were right about what they wanted. Neither side was honest with the other about it. The Scots would discover the deception at enormous cost in the years ahead. The Scottish army crossed the Tweed on the 19th of January, 1644, commanded by Alexander Leslie, the Earl of Leven, a veteran of over a decade of continental warfare in the Swedish service, arguably the most experienced field commander in Britain. His army was seasoned, well-organized, and motivated by a religious conviction that made it formidable in ways that transcended numbers alone. It moved south into Northumberland and began pushing the Royalist forces back, joining with the parliamentary armies of Lord Fairfax and the Earl of Manchester to besiege York, the last major Royalist stronghold in the north. Charles sent Prince Rupert north to relieve the city. Rupert executed a campaign of considerable brilliance, outmaneuvering the besieging armies with a feint that drew them away from York's northern approach, crossing the Ouse at Boroughbridge and entering the city without fighting a major engagement. He had saved York. He then did something harder to explain. Despite being outnumbered by nearly 10,000 men, and despite receiving a letter from the king that most of his officers read as ambiguous at best, Rupert decided to offer battle the following morning on the open moorland west of York. His certainty that he could win was absolute. He was wrong. On the evening of the 2nd of July, 1644, the two armies faced each other across Marston Moor, Rupert's 18,000 Royalists on lower ground, the combined Parliamentary and Scottish force of 28,000 drawn up on a ridge above them. Rupert had spent the afternoon waiting for the last of the York garrison to arrive, and by early evening he had concluded that it was too late in the day for a serious engagement. He retired to his coach. Newcastle withdrew to his carriage for a pipe of tobacco. At 7:30, with a thunderstorm breaking over the moor, the entire parliamentary line came over the ridge and down the slope at a run. On the parliamentary left, Oliver Cromwell led his cavalry against the Royalist horse under Lord Byron. Byron countercharged before his own musketeers could fire, disordering his own line, and Cromwell's troopers drove through them. Rupert brought his reserve forward, and the fighting became brutal. Cromwell took a pistol ball to the neck and left the field briefly to have the wound dressed. In his absence, the Scottish cavalry under David Leslie hit Rupert's reserve in the flank, and the Royalist right wing broke entirely. Rupert himself was unhorsed in the chaos and spent part of the battle hiding in a bean field. His beloved hunting dog, a white poodle named Boy that had accompanied him through every campaign of the war, was killed on the moor. On the other wing, where Lord Goring's Royalist cavalry had done what Royalist cavalry always did, won their engagement brilliantly, and then kept going, pursuing the broken parliamentary right wing off the field and into the baggage train beyond the ridge. The Royalist infantry in the center, under Newcastle's command, had pushed the parliamentary foot back, and for a time, It looked as though the battle might still be recoverable. It was not. Cromwell, his wound dressed, returned to the field, wheeled his unbroken cavalry around the rear of the Royalist line, and hit Goring's infantry from behind. Newcastle's foot, the famous whitecoats in their undyed woolen coats, refused to run. They were surrounded in a ditch and killed where they stood, almost to the last man. When the killing was finished, 4,000 Royalists lay dead on Marston Moor. The north of England was gone. York surrendered 2 weeks later. The Earl of Newcastle, whose armies had controlled the north for 2 years and whose prestige had been the foundation of the Royalist position there, could not bear the weight of the defeat. He rode to Scarborough and took ship for Hamburg, abandoning Charles's cause entirely and going into an exile he would not leave for 18 years. Rupert rode south, carrying the king's ambiguous letter in his pocket, where he would keep it for the rest of his life. The battle had done something beyond ending the Royalist north. It had produced a name. Prince Rupert, encountering Cromwell's cavalry for the first time as a formed, disciplined force that won its engagement and then stopped, that did not break ranks and ride off the field chasing glory, had called them Ironsides in a mixture of fury and reluctant admiration. The name stuck. Cromwell had spent 2 years arguing that the Parliamentary cavalry needed to be different. At Marston Moor, in the middle of a thunderstorm, with a wound in his neck and the largest battle of the war still turning around him, he had proved it. The winter of 1644 into 1645 was a season of reckoning inside Parliament. The war had been running for 2.5 years. Marston Moor had destroyed the Royalist north, but the campaigns in the south had been a catalogue of squandered opportunities. Essex had lost an entire army at Lostwithiel in Cornwall. Manchester had let Charles escape after the Second Battle of Newbury, when pursuit would have finished the war. Cromwell, who had watched Manchester's hesitation with barely contained fury, finally said in Parliament what many had been thinking. The war was being lost, not by bad soldiers, but by commanders who did not want to win it decisively, because winning decisively would force them to decide what came next. The instrument that changed this was the Self-Denying Ordinance, passed in April 1645. It required every member of Parliament, Lords and Commons both, to resign any military command they held. Essex was out. Manchester was out. Lord Warwick lost the navy. The measure removed in a single stroke the aristocratic commanders who had led Parliament's armies from the beginning and had led them, on the whole, with a caution that served their political interests rather than the war effort. The logic was brutal and essentially accurate. Men who had seats in Parliament had reasons to keep the war inconclusive, and those reasons had nothing to do with winning. Cromwell was a member of the House of Commons, which meant the ordinance applied to him too. He resigned his commission as required. Parliament then gave him a temporary exemption, and then another, and then made the exemption permanent on the grounds that his cavalry command was too valuable to lose. The procedural gymnastics were noticed and commented on at the time. Parliament had passed a law that applied to everyone and then quietly ensured that the one man it most needed was not bound by it. It was the first sign that the war machine Parliament was building was going to develop priorities of its own. The new model army that took shape through the early months of 1645 was unlike anything England had fielded before. It comprised 11 regiments of cavalry, 12 of infantry, and 1 of dragoons, roughly 22,000 men in total, paid from centralized taxation rather than from the pockets of local magnates, uniformed in red coats of standardized cut and drilled to a standard of discipline that made them, regiment for regiment, the most effective fighting force on English soil. Promotion moved on merit rather than birth. Officers who had proved themselves capable in the field held their commissions regardless of their social standing. Men who had never sat in a great house commanded men who had. The commander appointed to lead it was Sir Thomas Fairfax, 32 years old, a Yorkshire baronet who had been fighting since the war's opening months, and who had the rare quality, in that intensely politicized conflict, of being trusted by almost everyone. He was not an independent, not a Presbyterian, not a political operator of any kind that Parliament needed to manage. He was a soldier, and he had been very good at it since at Walton Moor, and after, even in defeat. Parliament gave him the command precisely because he was difficult to fit into the factional architecture of Westminster. He accepted it without conditions and without complications, which in the spring of 1645 made him almost unique. The new model army met the Royalist field army for the first time at Naseby in Northamptonshire on the 14th of June, 1645. Charles had roughly 9,000 men. Fairfax had 14,000, with Cromwell commanding the cavalry on the right wing. Prince Rupert, who had advised against fighting, was overruled by his uncle and led the Royalist cavalry in the opening charge with his accustomed ferocity. He broke the Parliamentary left wing entirely and rode straight through it, pursuing the fleeing horsemen all the way to the Parliamentary baggage train, where his men stopped to plunder. It was Edgehill again, Roundway down again, every wasted cavalry triumph of the previous 3 years, repeated one final time on the fields of Northamptonshire. While Rupert was gone, Cromwell drove the Royalist cavalry on the opposite wing from the field, halted his men before they could follow their opponents into the distance, reformed their lines, and turned them back into the battle. The Royalist infantry in the center, fighting hard against Fairfax's foot, found Cromwell's cavalry arriving on their flank with nowhere to go. The king himself attempted to lead his reserve into the fight. His companions seized his bridle and turned his horse, preventing the charge on the grounds that they could not risk losing him. The army that remained of his cause disintegrated around him. He watched from a distance as it ended. The Royalists lost 1,000 men killed and 5,000 captured, among them nearly every experienced infantry officer who had served since 1642. They lost all their artillery, all their powder, and all their stored arms. They also lost something that proved more damaging than any of it: Charles's personal baggage, which contained his private correspondence. His letters showed in his own handwriting that he had been negotiating to bring Irish Catholic troops and continental mercenaries into England to fight his own subjects. Parliament published them immediately in a pamphlet called "The King's Cabinet Opened." The men who had spent years hoping for a negotiated settlement with their king read his private letters and understood, with a finality that months of battlefield argument had not produced, that there was nothing left to negotiate. Within a year, the First War was over. Garrison after garrison fell through the summer and autumn of 1645. Bristol surrendered to Fairfax in September. The last Royalist field army under Lord Goring was destroyed at Langport in July. By the spring of 1646, Charles had nowhere left to go. On the 5th of May, 1646, he rode quietly out of Oxford in disguise and surrendered himself, not to Parliament, but to the Scottish army camped at Newark. He had been thinking about the Scots for months. He was already planning what came next. The First War had ended. The king had merely changed the terrain. Charles I surrendered in May 1646, but he did not concede. There is a difference, and he understood it clearly. A man who surrenders gives up his weapons. A man who concedes gives up his position. Charles gave up the field and nothing else. He rode out of Oxford in disguise, presented himself to the Scottish army at Newark, and immediately began negotiating, not to end the war on Parliament's terms, but to find the combination of promises and delays that would eventually restore him on his own. He had been defeated militarily. He was now fighting a different kind of war, and he believed he was rather better suited to it. The Scots had their price. They wanted Presbyterianism established in England, the church settlement that Parliament had promised them in the Solemn League and Covenant, and that Parliament's independent faction had no intention of honoring. Charles spent 9 months at Newcastle talking, praying, playing golf on the town moor, and declining to commit. He told the Scottish commissioners that his conscience would not permit him to impose a church settlement he did not believe in upon his English subjects. He said this with complete sincerity. He also said it knowing that his refusal kept the negotiations alive while he looked for better options elsewhere. The Scots eventually concluded that he was worth more as a debt than as an ally. In January 1647, they sold him to Parliament for £400,000, the first installment of the money Parliament owed them for the war, and marched home. The sense of betrayal among ordinary Scots, who regarded their Stuart king as something close to sacred, was profound and lasting. Parliament installed Charles at Holdenby House in Northamptonshire, under house arrest that was comfortable enough to be almost dignified. He received visitors, walked in the gardens, played bowls, and continued the correspondence through which he was simultaneously negotiating with Parliament, the Army, the Scots, and various agents on the continent. Every faction that held him, or hoped to hold him, believed he was moving toward a settlement with them. None of them were wrong, precisely. It was because Charles had no intention of settling with any of them. He was keeping every option open and every negotiation live until the military balance shifted back in his favor. His opponents, watching him do this, called it duplicity. He called it the only rational response to an impossible situation. By the summer of 1647, the new model army had become a political force that Parliament could no longer control. The soldiers were owed months of back pay. Infantry were owed 18 weeks, cavalry 43. And Parliament's response had been to propose disbanding most of the army without paying what it owed, and without providing the legal indemnity that soldiers needed to protect themselves from prosecution for actions taken during the war. The Army's response was to organize. Elected representatives from every regiment, and called agitators, formed a council that began issuing demands alongside the officer corps. By June, the army was effectively a political party with weapons, and Charles was the prize at the center of a three-way contest between Parliament, the army, and the Scots. On the night of the 2nd of June 1647, a young cavalry officer named George Joyce arrived at Holdenby with 500 troopers and took charge of the King's Guard. The following morning, Charles emerged to find Joyce drawn up in the courtyard with his men behind him. He asked with the dry composure that had become his only reliable weapon what commission Joyce held for this action. Joyce gestured at the ranks of cavalry behind him. Charles looked at the troopers and said that it was indeed a fine commission and as good as he had seen in his life. He went with them without resistance, noting privately that the Army's terms were more generous than Parliament's and calculating that the widening split between the two was working in his favor. For a time, it appeared that his calculation was correct. The Army's leadership, Cromwell and his son-in-law Henry Ireton, produced a set of negotiating terms called the Heads of Proposals that were, by the standards of what Parliament had offered, remarkably moderate. The Church of England would remain largely intact. Former Royalists would be treated leniently. Charles would keep much of his executive authority. Cromwell even told a friend around this time that the king was the most conscientious man in his 3 kingdoms. He meant it, in the way one means a compliment that contains a warning. The negotiations proceeded. Charles listened, but expressed interest and kept writing to the Scots. In October 1647, the Putney debates opened, a series of extraordinary arguments inside the Army's General Council held in the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Putney, between the Army's senior officers and the elected agitators who represented the rank and file. The soldiers' representatives, influenced by a radical movement called the Levelers, arrived with a document called the Agreement of the People, a draft constitution that proposed manhood suffrage, equality before the law, and the abolition of the monarchy. Cromwell and Ireton argued against it, insisting that property and social order could not survive universal suffrage. The king, receiving reports of soldiers arguing for his removal at the army's own council table, He understood for the first time that not everyone negotiating with him had negotiating as their ultimate purpose. He escaped from Hampton Court in November 1647, slipping out through a garden door at night with 2 companions, and made for the Isle of Wight, intending to sail to France. The governor of Carisbrooke Castle, Colonel Robert Hammond, was a parliamentary officer who had no intention of letting him leave. Charles found himself in a tighter imprisonment than before, on an island with no easy exits, and immediately resumed negotiations from there. On the 26th of December 1647, he signed a secret treaty with the Scots, the Engagement, promising to establish Presbyterianism in England for 3 years in exchange for a Scottish invasion on his behalf. He signed it and told no one in England about it. And by the spring of 1648, the Scottish army was mobilizing, Royalist uprisings were breaking out across England and Wales, and the men who had spent 2 years trying to reach a settlement with their king finally accepted what the army's radicals had known since Putney. There was no settlement to be reached. The spring of 1648 brought something that most of England had believed was finished: war. Not everywhere at once, but in a rolling series of uprisings that broke out across the country through March, April, and May. In South Wales, where parliamentary garrisons mutinied under officers who had changed sides. In Kent, where 10,000 people gathered near Rochester and declared for the king. In Essex, where Royalist forces seized Colchester and held it against Fairfax for 11 weeks. Each uprising was, in isolation, manageable. Together, they announced that the settlement everyone had been working toward for 2 years was further away than it had ever been, and that Charles, imprisoned, negotiating, apparently powerless, had been the architect of all of it. The Scottish invasion came in July. The Engager army that crossed the border under the Duke of Hamilton was not the seasoned force that Leven had led south in 1644. David Leslie and thousands of experienced officers had refused to serve, unwilling to fight in a war they considered a betrayal of the Covenant's principles. What Hamilton had instead were raw levies, inadequately armed and poorly coordinated, spread across a line of march that stretched for miles through the Lancashire countryside. His cavalry had ridden ahead to forage. His infantry were strung out along the road from Carlisle to Preston, and with their commander unable to concentrate them quickly enough to matter. Cromwell moved from South Wales with a speed that no one on the Royalist side had anticipated. He had spent 2 months reducing Pembroke Castle and was marching his men through a wet and punishing summer, their clothes worn out and their shoes disintegrating on the roads. He linked up with Lambert's northern force at Wetherby on the 12th of August and turned west without pausing. 4 days later, he was above Preston with 8,600 veterans, looking down at an Engager army 3 times his size that did not know he was there. He attacked on the morning of the 17th of August, hitting Hamilton's rearguard on Preston Moor, while the bulk of the Scottish army was already crossing the Ribble to the south. The fighting on the moor was fierce. Langdale's English Royalists held for 4 hours against the full weight of the new model infantry before breaking. By nightfall, Cromwell had forced the Ribble crossing and was driving the Scots south in a running pursuit that would last 3 days and cover more than 30 miles. Hamilton was captured at Atoxter on the 25th. Around 2,000 of his men were dead and 9,000 were prisoners. Cromwell reported his own losses to Parliament at 100 at most. It was not quite accurate, but it was not far wrong. Fairfax was less merciful at Colchester, where the siege had dragged through the summer with the town's civilian population slowly starving alongside its garrison. When the Royalists finally surrendered on the 28th of August, Fairfax had 2 of the senior commanders shot in the castle yard, Sir Charles Lucas and Sir George Lisle, both of whom had fought in the First War and had given their word not to take up arms again. Lisle told the firing party to come closer so they would not miss. Lucas and Lisle died because Fairfax had decided that the men who had brought this second war on England's people deserved no quarter. The war of chivalrous gestures, of prisoners paroled and gentlemen treated according to their rank, was over. In the weeks after Preston and Colchester, something changed in the new model army that could not be changed back. The soldiers had fought one war, won it, and then watched their prisoner start another one. They had marched through a ruined summer on shoes that fell apart and clothing that rotted, nigh fighting men who had no real cause other than the king's calculation that their divisions could be exploited. The army gathered at Windsor in late September for a 3-day prayer meeting. Hymns, sermons, long silences, and the kind of collective grief that finds its way toward resolution through religion. Out of that meeting came a shared conclusion. Charles Stuart was a man of blood. The phrase came from the Book of Numbers, a ruler who shed innocent blood and whose land could not be cleansed except by the blood of the one who had shed it. The army had decided in the language of Scripture what needed to happen next. The moderate majority in Parliament had not reached the same conclusion. Through October and November 1648, Presbyterian MPs resumed negotiations with Charles at Newport on the Isle of Wight. Ned and Charles negotiated with his customary combination of apparent flexibility and absolute refusal to concede anything that mattered. He agreed to Presbyterian church government for 3 years. He agreed to parliamentary control of the military for 10 years. He agreed to the punishment of his leading supporters, with exceptions so broad they covered almost everyone he cared about. The Newport negotiations produced a form of words that meant nothing. Both sides knew it. The army watched from outside Westminster and drew its own conclusions about what the moderates in Parliament intended. On the 20th of November 1648, Henry Ireton presented the Army's answer to the Newport negotiations, a document called the Remonstrance of the Army, demanding that the king be brought to trial and that the moderate MPs who were trying to restore him be removed from Parliament. The grandees of the army were done with negotiating. They had fought twice. They had won twice. They had watched the man they defeated start a second war from inside a castle on an island. Whatever legal architecture a trial required, whatever constitutional fiction a court would need to exercise jurisdiction over a king, they were prepared to construct it. The question of what England did with Charles I had left the realm of politics entirely and entered the realm of the irreversible. On the morning of the 6th of December 1648, MPs arriving at Westminster to take their seats found soldiers blocking the entrance to St. Stephen's Chapel. This Colonel Thomas Pride stood at the top of the stairs with a list in his hand, and Lord Grey of Groby beside him, who knew the faces of the members well enough to identify them as they arrived. Those on the list were turned away or arrested. Those not on it were allowed through. 45 members were taken into custody and held for the most part in a pair of inns along the Strand, one of which was called Hell. A further 186 were excluded without arrest. What remained of the Long Parliament, the body that had been sitting since November 1640, was a rump of fewer than 200 men, most of them too frightened or too committed to leave. Pride's Purge was the only military coup in English parliamentary history. It was also, in its way, the logical conclusion of everything that had happened since the army seized the king at Holdenby 18 months before. The army had tried negotiating with Parliament. Parliament had kept talking to Charles. Charles had started a second war. The army's patience had a limit, and the limit had been reached. What had begun as a constitutional struggle between a king and his parliament ended on the stairs of St. Stephen's with soldiers and a list. The army deciding who was permitted to govern England and who was not. The rump parliament that remained after the Purge voted on the 1st of January 1649 to establish a High Court of Justice to try the king on charges of high treason. The Lords refused. The rump declared that the Commons alone represented the sovereign authority of the people and proceeded without them. The court was constituted with 135 commissioners. On the first day of the trial, only 68 showed up. Of the 59 men who would eventually sign the death warrant, the majority came under considerable pressure, some direct and some implied, from the army officers who surrounded them. Several later claimed their hands had been guided. Some of them were probably telling the truth. Charles was brought to Westminster Hall on the 20th of January, 1649. The hall was the largest in England, a cavernous medieval space that the court had dressed in scarlet to give it the weight of formal justice. Charles walked in carrying a cane with a silver head and wearing the blue ribbon of the Order of the Garter. He sat in the dock and looked at the court without removing his hat. When the charge was read that he had traitorously and maliciously levied war against the people of England, he laughed. The laughter was not contempt exactly, but something closer to genuine disbelief that the men in front of him imagined they had the authority to do what they were doing. He asked in a voice that for once did not stammer, by what lawful authority he had been brought there. John Bradshaw, the court's president, a relatively obscure lawyer who had been appointed because more eminent ones had declined, told him the authority of the Commons of England in the name of the people. Charles replied that England had been a hereditary kingdom for nearly 1,000 years, not an elected one, and asked again for lawful authority. Bradshaw told him to answer the charge, and Charles refused to enter a plea on the grounds that no court on earth had jurisdiction over a king. Under the law as it stood, a refusal to plead was treated as a confession of guilt. Charles knew this. He refused anyway. The trial lasted 7 days across 3 sessions. Witnesses were heard in private, since Charles would not participate in proceedings he did not recognize. On the 27th of January, the commissioners assembled for the verdict. As the sentence of death was pronounced, each commissioner present rose to his feet to signal assent. Charles tried to speak. He was told the court was adjourned. He was still trying to speak as they led him out. Some in the public galleries called out for God to bless him. Others called out for justice. He was taken back to St. James's Palace and given 3 days. It's on the evening of the 29th of January. He was allowed to say goodbye to 2 of his children, Elizabeth, aged 13, and Henry, aged 8. Elizabeth, who kept a written account of the meeting, recorded that her father told her not to grieve for him, that it was a glorious death he would die, dying for the laws and liberties of the land. He told her to forgive those who had done it. He told Henry that he was not to let them make him a king while his brothers Charles and James still lived, because then they would cut off his brother's head. Henry, who was 8, said he would be torn in pieces first. Charles held him and wept. On the morning of the 30th of January 1649, Charles put on 2 shirts because the January cold might make him shiver, and he did not want the crowd to think he trembled from fear. And he was taken through the banqueting house, through the great hall whose ceiling Rubens had painted for his father James with images of the divine right of kings, and out onto the scaffold that had been built against its outer wall. He spoke briefly to those close enough to hear him. He said he died a Christian, a Protestant, and a king. He laid his head on the block. The axe fell once. A groan rose from the crowd, the sound that the eyewitness wrote he never wished to hear again. And with it began the problem of what England was supposed to do next. The men who had ordered the execution were, for the most part, not celebrating. They had done something that no European Christian nation had done before: tried and executed an anointed king in public in the name of law. And they understood, even in the moment, that the legitimacy of everything that followed depended on whether they could make what they had just done mean something. Oliver Cromwell, who had signed the warrant and who had pressed those around him to sign it, knelt alone for a long time in prayer after the execution. The Republic had 1 day of existence. The question of whether it deserved more than that had not yet begun to be answered. The Republic that emerged from Charles I's execution had no precedent and no template. England had abolished its monarchy, declared itself a Commonwealth governed by Parliament and a Council of State, and was now required to prove that what it had done was not merely destruction, but the beginning of something better. The men who had signed the death warrant understood this. where they had not removed a king in order to be governed by a committee of exhausted lawyers arguing over procedure. They had done it, or told themselves they had done it, because a better England was possible without the dead weight of a man who would not be governed by law. The better England needed to arrive relatively soon, or the question of what they had actually done would answer itself. The most immediate problem was Ireland. Since 1641, the island had been in a state of intermittent war, and following the execution of Charles I, the Irish Catholic Confederation had allied with the remaining Royalist forces to hold Ireland for the dead king's son. Parliament had incurred enormous debts financing the war, and its creditors had been promised repayment in Irish land, which meant Ireland needed to be conquered before the land could be confiscated and distributed. In August 1649, Cromwell landed at Dublin with 12,000 veterans of the new model army and a siege train heavy enough to demolish any fortification in the country. He told his men they were fighting barbarous wretches. They believed him and behaved accordingly. At Drogheda, on the 11th of September 1649, after the garrison under Sir Arthur Aston rejected his summons to surrender, Cromwell's artillery breached the walls and his infantry stormed the town. What followed lasted through the night. Roughly 2,500 soldiers were killed, many of them after they had surrendered, and some of them in the steeple of St. Peter's Church, where Cromwell ordered the pews piled and set alight when the defenders refused to come down. An unknown number of civilians died in the streets and houses. Aston himself was beaten to death with his own wooden leg by soldiers who believed, incorrectly, that gold was hidden inside it. A month later at Wexford, the same pattern repeated itself. The town stormed before surrender terms were fully concluded, some 2,000 killed, the quayside running red into the harbor. Cromwell wrote to Parliament that both actions would tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future. He may have believed it. The military campaign that followed was effective and merciless. By the spring of 1650, most of eastern and southern Ireland was under Commonwealth control, and its surviving Catholic landowners dispossessed under the Act for the Settlement of Ireland, their estates distributed to Protestant soldiers and the financiers who had funded the conquest. Catholic land ownership fell from roughly 3/5 of Ireland's total to around 1/5 within a decade. The combination of war, deliberate destruction of food supplies, and the disease that followed famine carried away somewhere between 15 and 20% of Ireland's entire population. The republic that had gone to war against a king for ruling without the consent of the governed was reordering an entire country without consulting a single one of its inhabitants. Cromwell left Ireland in May 1650 and returned to England because Scotland had become the next emergency. The dead king's son, Charles II, now had accepted the Scots terms, Presbyterianism, the Covenant, everything his father had refused, and landed in Scotland in June. In September, at Dunbar on the Scottish coast, Cromwell faced a Scottish army of 14,000 on high ground above him, with his own force reduced by disease to barely 11,000. The Scots descended from their strong position the night before the expected attack, and Cromwell attacked them at dawn before they had fully formed. He described the victory as a signal mercy from God. 3,000 Scots were killed and 10,000 captured. Edinburgh fell a week later. The following summer, Charles II led the Scottish army south into England in a final Royalist gamble, hoping to raise the English countryside as he marched. The countryside did not rise, and at Worcester on the 3rd of September 1651, the anniversary of Dunbar, which Cromwell called his lucky day, the new model army destroyed the last Royalist army in Britain. Charles escaped from the battlefield, hid for 6 weeks in safe houses and Catholic attics, concealed himself famously in an oak tree at Boscobel while parliamentary search parties combed the ground below, and eventually reached the coast and sailed for France. He would not return for 9 years. The wars of the three kingdoms were over. England, Scotland, and Ireland were all under the authority of the Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell was the most powerful man in Britain, and Parliament was getting in the way. The rump parliament that had survived Pride's purge and ordered the king's execution had by 1653 been sitting for over 12 years. It was a diminished, self-selecting body of men who had shown little appetite for the radical reforms the army and the levelers had demanded, and considerable appetite for remaining in session without calling the elections that would replace them. Cromwell had pushed them for months. They had delayed, debated, and deflected. On the morning of the 20th of April 1653, having received word that the rump was attempting to pass a bill that would entrench its own membership, Cromwell walked into the chamber with a company of musketeers and told the MPs they had sat long enough. He called the mace, the symbol of parliamentary authority, a fool's bauble, and had it carried out. The MPs were removed from their seats and the doors were locked behind them. The man who had gone to war against a king for dissolving Parliament had dissolved Parliament himself. And he did it in the same room, from the same position of physical authority, for the same reason, because the Parliament in front of him was not doing what he needed it to do. The parallel was not lost on contemporaries. One MP, leaving the chamber after Cromwell's soldiers cleared it, said that this was not honest and asked what they should call this. No satisfying answer arrived. The Republic had now done twice in less than 5 years what it had executed a king for doing once. Cromwell spent the summer of 1653 attempting to replace the rump with a body more suited to governing a godly republic. He appointed 140 members himself, chosen for their religious seriousness and their willingness to pursue reform. This nominated parliament, called the bare-bones parliament by its critics after one of its members, a leather seller named Praise God Barbin, dissolved itself voluntarily in December, handing power back to Cromwell after 5 months of doctrinal arguments that had paralyzed any useful business. For the second time in 8 months, England had no functioning civilian government. The army filled the vacuum. The man the army had made dominant was now the only thing standing between England and a complete collapse of any authority at all. What he did next would settle, once and for all, what the English Civil War had actually been about. Oliver Cromwell had no intention of becoming a tyrant. This is worth stating plainly, because the distance between his intentions and his actions is the whole point. He genuinely believed in parliaments, in the rule of law, in government by consent. He had said so for 20 years, had fought for it, and had signed the death warrant of a king who he was convinced had betrayed those principles. The problem was that every parliament England produced in the 1650s turned out to be either incapable of governing or actively hostile to the army that had made everything possible. And each time a parliament failed, the same man was left standing in the wreckage with the same army behind him and no obvious alternative to simply governing without it. The instrument of government that took effect in December 1653 was England's first written constitution. 42 articles drafted primarily by Major General John Lambert that created the office of Lord Protector, a council of state, and a parliament elected every 3 years on a property franchise. It was an attempt, genuine and sophisticated, to build a republican government on rational foundations rather than inherited custom. Cromwell was installed as Lord Protector on the 16th of December in a plain ceremony at Westminster Hall. He wore black. There was no crown, no anointing, no claim to sacred authority. The contrast with everything Charles I had represented was deliberate and complete. The first Protectorate Parliament assembled in September 1654 and spent its entire sitting arguing about the instrument rather than governing under it. Former Republicans who resented the Protectorate's creation, Presbyterians who wanted a national church imposed by law, and moderates who simply wanted to limit Cromwell's power occupied the chamber for 4 months without passing a single piece of legislation. Cromwell dissolved it in January 1655, as having technically waited the minimum 5 months specified by the instrument. He counted in lunar months rather than calendar months to reach the figure. The legal ingenuity was noticed. It was exactly the kind of maneuver that had made ship money infamous 20 years before. A small Royalist uprising in the west of England in March 1655, the Penruddock Rising, so modest that it was suppressed in days, gave Cromwell the justification he needed for what followed. England and Wales were divided into 11 military districts, each governed by a major general appointed from the Army's senior ranks. These men collected taxes, suppressed dissent, enforced the Sabbath, and closed the alehouses and bear-baiting rings and theaters that Puritan doctrine condemned as ungodly. They were, in their conduct and their powers, and indistinguishable from the military governors that Charles I had been accused of planning and that Parliament had gone to war to prevent. The country that had executed a king for threatening arbitrary rule was now governed by 11 unelected soldiers, answerable only to one man. The rule of the major generals lasted barely a year. It was not ended by constitutional principle, but by money. Parliament refused to fund it in 1656, and Cromwell, who needed Parliament's taxation to survive, conceded. He called a second Protectorate Parliament and purged it in advance, excluding the members whose opposition he could predict. The body that assembled was, as a result, more cooperative than its predecessor and considerably less representative of the country it was supposed to govern. But its members were chosen by a small group of military elites rather than by the constituents who were supposed to send them. Charles I had done something structurally identical with the nominated Parliament of 1640. The Commonwealth had dissolved a parliament for doing so. Cromwell had now done it himself. In the spring of 1657, this cooperative parliament offered Cromwell the crown. The humble petition and advice, as the proposal was called, would have made him King Oliver I, with a hereditary succession and all the traditional legal apparatus of English monarchy. Cromwell agonized over it for 6 weeks, genuinely, according to everyone who observed him in that period. He told Parliament finally that he would not seek to set up what Providence had destroyed and laid in the dust. He told them he would not build Jericho again. Yet the Army's radical core would not have forgiven him for accepting, and he knew it. He refused the crown and accepted everything else that came with it: the authority, the prerogatives, the power of appointment, the right to name his own successor. On the 26th of June, 1657, Cromwell was reinvested as Lord Protector in Westminster Hall, the same hall where Charles I had been tried 8 years before. He sat in King Edward's coronation chair. He was dressed in purple robes lined with ermine. He was handed a sword of justice, a sceptre, and a Bible. The ceremony was a coronation in everything except the word. He was addressed as Your Highness. He began creating hereditary peers. The republic that had abolished the House of Lords quietly restored something that functioned as one. A Venetian diplomat watching the investiture reported back to his government that the new protector lacked nothing but the crown to appear a veritable king, and that if he lived, it would probably be placed on his head. In the summer of 1658, his daughter Elizabeth died of cancer at 29. Cromwell had loved her with the particular intensity of a father who had long since put the rest of his life in service to God and history. He never recovered from it. Through August, he sickened. A urinary infection, probably, complicated by the malaria he had carried since the Irish campaign. And those around him watched a man who had governed Britain for nearly a decade run out of the will to continue. On the 3rd of September, 1658, the anniversary of Dunbar and Worcester, his lucky day, Oliver Cromwell died at Whitehall. He was 59 years old. He had been the most powerful man in Britain for the better part of a decade, and he had produced no stable system of government to outlast him. His son Richard succeeded him as Lord Protector. Richard was a decent, quiet country gentleman who had spent the Civil War years farming in Hampshire, and who had no particular relationship with the army that had made the Protectorate possible. The Army's senior officers regarded him with polite contempt. Parliament, meeting in Richard's name, began arguing with the Army within weeks. By April 1659, barely 8 months after his father's death, Richard Cromwell had resigned the protectorship and retired to Hampshire. He would live in obscurity for another 50 years, and dying at the age of 85, the longest lived of anyone who had held the supreme authority of England in the 17th century and the least remembered. The republic he left behind him had no head, no army it could control, and no idea what to do next. What followed was 7 months of mounting chaos. The Rump Parliament returned, was dissolved by the army again, was restored again. Lambert marched an army south and seized control of London. General George Monk, commanding the Parliamentary forces in Scotland, marched his own army south in the opposite direction. He was methodical and unhurried and said almost nothing about his intentions as he came. He crossed the Tweed in January 1660 and moved through a country that had been governed by improvisation for 2 years and had run out of patience with all of it. By the time he reached London in February, the Republic had effectively ceased to function. The only question remaining was who would replace it, and almost everyone already knew the answer. By the spring of 1660, England had exhausted every alternative. The Republic was gone in everything but name. The army was unpaid, divided, and had dissolved 3 governments in 7 months. Lambert, who had marched south to hold London by force, watched his soldiers desert him regiment by regiment until he was riding through the city almost alone. He was arrested in March and sent to the Tower. The men who had spent nearly 2 decades insisting that England could be governed without a king had run out of ideas and run out of each other. What remained was General George Monk, his army, and a country that had simply had enough. Monk was among the most opaque figures of the entire period. A professional soldier who had served Charles I, then Cromwell, then Richard, and who had said almost nothing in public about his intentions as he marched south from Scotland in January 1660. He restored the members excluded by Pride's Purge to the Long Parliament, which then dissolved itself and called elections for a new convention parliament. The members who arrived in April were mostly moderate, mostly conservative, and mostly already decided. On the 1st of May 1660, the convention voted unanimously that England should be governed by King, Lords, and Commons together. The Republic had lasted 11 years. Its end took an afternoon. Charles had been waiting in the Dutch city of Breda, then had spent the weeks before the vote preparing the declaration that would smooth his return. The Declaration of Breda, signed on the 4th of April, promised a general pardon to almost all who had opposed his father, religious toleration for those whose consciences would not conform to the established church, and a settlement of the land disputes that a decade of confiscation had created. Every specific was left deliberately vague, to be resolved by Parliament rather than the Crown, a device that would ensure Parliament, not Charles, bore responsibility for the disappointments that followed. His father's Chancellor, Edward Hyde, had taught him well. He had learned the lesson his father never had, that the words mattered less than who was blamed for their consequences. He landed at Dover on the 25th of May. Monk met him on the beach. Then Charles stepped ashore, knelt on the shingle, and gave thanks. He was 30 years old and had spent more than half his life in exile, in France, in the Spanish Netherlands, in the Dutch Republic, in whatever court would receive him and whatever pension would sustain him. He had learned languages and poverty and patience. The patience, in particular, had served him. He had watched Cromwell die and Richard collapse and Lambert ride into a city whose soldiers would not follow him, and he had simply waited. And now he was home. On the 29th of May 1660, his 30th birthday, Charles II rode into London. The diarist John Evelyn stood in the Strand and watched the procession pass for hours. He wrote that the ways were strewn with flowers, the bells ringing, the streets hung with tapestry, and fountains running with wine. The 20,000 soldiers rode through the city, brandishing their swords and shouting with what Evelyn called inexpressible joy. He stood in the Strand and blessed God, he wrote, and all this without one drop of blood, and by that very army which rebelled against him. The procession took 7 hours to pass through the city. It was already evening when Charles reached Whitehall. The men who had signed his father's death warrant were dealt with selectively. The Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, its title alone a masterpiece of deliberate forgetting, pardoned virtually everyone who had acted against the crown during the previous 2 decades. 10 regicides who had not fled were executed. The rest were left to live with what they had done in a country that had officially agreed to remember nothing. And several of Cromwell's closest associates lived out long, unmolested lives in English villages. Cromwell himself was dug from his tomb in Westminster Abbey, hanged in his shroud at Tyburn, and his head placed on a spike above Westminster Hall, where it stayed for more than 20 years, looking down on the Parliament he had dissolved at gunpoint. Parliament declared on the 8th of May that Charles II had been the lawful King of England since the moment his father's head was removed in January 1649. 11 years of republic were struck from the official record. Every legal document was redated as though the Commonwealth had never existed. The men who had been members of the Rump Parliament, who had passed the ordinances of the Commonwealth and governed England through the 1650s, were simply recast as subjects who had been temporarily and regrettably out of step with their rightful sovereign. The most radical political experiment in English history was officially declared not to have happened. What had happened then? The ledger of the English Civil War, totted up in the spring of 1660, made for extraordinary reading. Parliament had gone to war to protect ancient liberties from a king who would not be bound by law, and had ended the war governed by a man who dissolved parliaments at gunpoint, banned Christmas, and imposed unelected military governors on English counties. The Scots had gone to war for their church and ended the decade occupied by an English army, their parliament abolished, their country formally incorporated into the English Republic against their will. The Levelers, who had fought for genuine popular democracy and equality before the law, were shot in a churchyard at Burford by the army they had served. Ireland had been remade by conquest, its Catholic landowners dispossessed, somewhere between 1/5 and 2/5 of its population dead from war, famine, and plague. And the crown, the thing Parliament had spent 7 years fighting to restrain, was back on a Stuart head, sitting in Whitehall, promising to rule with Parliament's consent. Not everything was unchanged. The prerogative courts that Charles I had used to punish his opponents were gone. Ship money was gone. The principle that Parliament must meet regularly and that taxation required parliamentary consent was more firmly established in 1660 than it had ever been before. The monarchy that Charles II inherited was quieter in its claims than the one his father had lost. The divine right theology that Charles I had held as an article of personal faith never fully recovered its public force in England. In that limited sense, the war had produced something. The men who died at Edgehill and Marston Moor and Naseby and Preston had not died for nothing. They had settled permanently some questions that the old unwritten Constitution had left dangerously open. But the distance between what those questions cost to settle and what the settlement actually produced is the measure of what the English Civil War was. 190,000 people died in England alone, in battle, from the disease that followed armies, from the famine that followed the destruction of crops and livestock, from the accumulated weight of a decade of continuous violence. Scotland and Ireland added hundreds of thousands more. And when it was over, John Evelyn stood in the Strand on a May evening and watched the dead king's son ride home through streets strewn with flowers, carried into Whitehall by the very army that had destroyed his father. The war had answered the questions it had raised. It simply had not answered them in the way anyone who raised them had intended. Nobody won. And England, in the exhausted relief of that summer evening, cheered anyway.